Alright, so essentially in cop gang pedo porner, essentially these people, when they do 50 slutting with pigs, where they horribly blackmail women. They do. And they rape them and they turn them into schizos and shit, and they do all that sex slaving shit to them. They do. So, the punishment that they get nowadays is to get 50 slutted. Basically, it is. And so the indicator of that will be them essentially utilizing their computer to communicate in a yes and no way. That is the pretty much the universal. It's kind of the universal like indicator of being highly blackmailed and also having these schizophrenic forms of schizophrenia kind of stuff. Basically, the fuck switch shit. Yeah. And so that is where nowadays a lot of times these women rack up a shit ton of money or debt inside of the hookup sites or something. So nowadays the magic team comes around, and then when they find one, okay, when they find one of these women, then essentially a bunch of other women, like porn stars and prostitutes and facetious feminists, witches, and military guys, and dumb fucks. Basically, they sit around watching them, these people, the ones that do that stuff. They sit around watching like a TV show, them get turned into that. And then usually some military guy gets on their screen at the end. And then this woman essentially doesn't get 50 slutted anymore. And then the military guy screams bitch in their face. Okay? And that essentially this woman, that money basically from watching this process, like pay-per-view, pays back all the stuff that they like rack up in debts, because nobody tells them about all that stuff. Okay? Nobody tells them about the services that they get. All that stuff ends up costing money. They end up having to be forced prostitutes to be paying it back and shit. Basically. And so that's where this process racks up serious money and it pays that stuff back. It's kind of the internal problem. It's an internal solution to the problem, basically. It's like a solution inside of the problem. It takes away the owed debt that they end up accruing. And basically it uses the people that did all that to them, and then they get 50 slutted. Usually in the exact specific way. Basically. The exact specific way that they did it to the women that they find. I mean, that's basically it. So that's what they do in the dark web. And so the reality is that the cop gang is usually always a part of doing that. And so it's going to start to emerge that cop gangs are going to start to have people with this type of indicator. And yeah, that's where none of that stuff usually happens to any male in it, unless they do this stuff. Basically. And so the whole idea is that nobody really actually does that stuff correctly. There's a real satanic process to that stuff, and if they don't do it correctly, then they get turned into what they created. Essentially, they'll have built their own satanic sex slaving method, and then that method gets used on them. See, essentially in the dark web, if you do the correct method, then that wouldn't be allowable or something. But these people, they don't actually get taught ever how to do that stuff correctly. They don't ever get access to the other types of satanic psychology building stuff. And that another thing is that if you focus on somebody that would have had that type of stuff as a child, then you'll be getting. See, that's like what it is. If they had that type of stuff happen as a child, like me and shit, if they ever focused that idea on me, then they would literally get that. Because you're not allowed to do that to the child SRA victims, even as adults. You're just not allowed. You're not allowed to fuck switch them. You're not allowed to do anything to them. These are the rules. Even in 50 pedo porner. So essentially, there's going to be a few different ideas on what gets those cops to be all crazy and shit. And that is where a lot of times they like to focus on like real SRA victims when they do this type of shit. And that if they do that to real SRA victims, then there's a real satanic, it's like a real punishment. It's a real punishment. And it's a whole structured, very authentic satanic punishment. See, this is an example, artistically, I guess, of a person that got the real satanic punishment for fucking with an SRA person. Basically. And so that is where these type of psychological outputs basically are a sign of them specifically victimizing or creating an SRA child. See, they get this if they create a new enchantment child. If they have sex with those children, they get this. If they fuck with some adult that is a SRA victim, then they get this. And it's a real, it's basically, it severs, it's psychologically outputs in somewhat of this TV show's way. And so, that is kind of where, that there's two types of punishments, okay? So, if the chick is like a child SRA victim, then they're gonna get severed. That is what the punishment is in 50 pedo porner. And so that is where anybody that was doing fuck switching to SRA victims, even when they're an adult, then they have to get their brain severed. Okay? They just do. That's what the punishment is. That's what it is in those. That's why in the past, Cop Gang would always like avoid. They used to avoid real SRA victims. Basically. Because because you get severed. You do. The whole idea is that their black males get exposed, and then essentially they agree to the process because the alternative is basically to output it. Basically, then that would throw them in prison for being a psychotic sick fuck. So that's usually, nowadays, they're always doing this. This is like where on dark web, pretty much this whole process gets like exploitation, basically the whole process, and that the pay-per-view stuff comes into play, and like The whole idea is that the option is either to essentially have a whole federal government be able to collect all of the most horrible, rotten Satanism of this person in a way that would be arrestable. I mean, that's what it is. So usually they choose to do this process, and then this process makes them forget. They always forget. And then that process ends up having to be redone all the fucking time. Okay? Well, most of these cops will understand, right? When one of these witches gets reintegrated, then stupid little bitch cops come by, fuck switching them into schizos again. And that's where every time a wizard reintegrates them, then a bunch of fucking little piggies come along and they end up raping them, and it fucks up their it decompartmentalizes their brain again into somewhat of a structured schizophrenia kind of way, and that there's a reintegration ability, and that right when that happens, then these fucking psychos come along and they basically rape. It's like, here's their psyche reintegrated, and then once these people notice that, then they split them apart psychologically from rape and trauma and sexual slaving and all the stuff that they did to create that. Basically. And so that's pretty much where, I mean, the dark web pretty much has predictability that, yeah, most of the cop gang ends up doing this. It's like there's not really much that you can do in these satanic S&Ms. They operate illegally, but this is like where this is like what their cover-up is. Basically. And that this process, that shit will continue until this process is achieved. And then if they don't stay in this state of mind, then they continually get satanically sex slave. See, this is why they get all crazy. This process turns them into a psychopath. Those people in the past used to get shot. And then everybody would sit around and would wait for the person to get shot. So nowadays, so many people do this that essentially there's just too many. This process, this idea used to be only a very few people would ever do that stuff. Now it's like S&M, basically, and that is it's more prevalent, it's more common. People are doing this stuff more and more and more and more, and it's creating more situations where more of these people are going to start to emerge. This is like, imagine like building Jeffrey Dahmers and stuff. Ted Kaczynski's. Basically, like Ted Kaczynski, he would be like the Nazis' punishment version of Nazi S&M. And that then in Satan S&M, it would be like Jeffrey Dahmer and shit like that, or Helter Skelter and shit like that. Basically, like Charles Manson. That is kind of like where the clown, I forget his name, right off the bat. He has a movie, yeah. The big fat clown psycho from the 60s or whatever. That guy, he would have had this. He would have been doing satanic S&M because they all do. That's where you essentially, like, there's just satanic S&M or Satanism, basically. And so that's where they get punished because somebody finds out what they're doing. And you see how even back then, Cop Gang, John Wayne Gacy, that Cop Gang was, sleazy Cop Gang was sitting right outside of his fucking house. Okay? That's because they would have known through satanic S&M that he was doing stuff like that. Or through Satanism. They would have known, and that in the past, Cop Gang they would be sleazy. But they would sit outside of these people's fucking houses. They would just sit right there. And it was meant to like slowly build like an ultimate paranoia in them, and then they would usually make mistakes. Basically. And so that's the whole idea, is that to build John Wayne Gacy's, Jeffrey Dahmer's, usually it revolves around doing this. That's what happens. That's why the mask stuff, all that shit, that's the shit that builds Jeffrey Dahmer's and John Wayne Gacy's and shit. It builds them into that. It does. So, this is like where it's Satanism, okay? So their cover up is to be built into a fucking psycho. Like John Wayne Gacy, or, you know. The whole idea is that, like, David Koresh, he is essentially like, he's like he would be like the Klan's S&M version of this. Would have gone through a slightly variant version of this. Basically. That's just what happens. That's what happens. See, Satanism, this is all, they all have to accept this type of shit. And that, like, this is what it is in real Satanism, is that real Satanism has to, since they're basically being Satanists, real Satanists have to support their Satanism, kind of, basically. And that's where nowadays cop gang, it used to be the sleazies that would be outside of the John Wayne Gacy house. Now they're doing the stuff that has them being built into the John Wayne Gacy's. Okay, so this is like where this has happened sometimes in the past. That is where Dom then used to fill in for the sleazy cops at the cops. Right, I mean, that usually they would figure out ways of getting the cop busted. It's like the New York City cop that was like writing rape fetishes and book fetishy ways, and then was raping women in those ways. He would have fallen into this type of idea. And that more than likely dumb military guys, they probably would have pushed that information to the authorities in some way. And if you see, like, you know, if you look on the Facebook news and stuff, you'll start to see that there's more and more, like, cops that are emerging. A lot of those cops do that stuff in cop gang. They're, like, getting busted for certain crimes and stuff. And then a lot of those cops are in cop gang. And so this is, like, where I usually review through the news, because I look for instances of police officers, because usually they don't ever, the whole idea is that around here, this process continues. Nobody kills them, and nobody pushes information or any evidence out. And so then they turn into more of a psycho, more of a psycho, more of a psycho, more, and it just continues. And then eventually they become like top level super psychos in like a Jeffrey Dahmer style way, or John Wayne Gacy kind of way, or Green River Killer. That dude, he was in sleazy prostitution world and stuff, and then he was going around, probably was in a satanic S&M or a Satanist cult of some sort, and then he would have been thrusted out of that world, and then it probably would have been the fault of some prostitutes who would have noticed him in the past. Then he would have been sitting around. The Satanist would have been doing this probably as a service. Instead of going to prison, they like have to do this instead. And that is like basically then the Satanists, they sit around doing that all the time, and then they're being a psycho. And that's kind of one of the, it's, you know, Mormon has like different wards kind of. This is where they're that's like a different faction of Satanism, and so the other factions of Satanism essentially like they have to be allowed to do theirs or something like that, and so that is like where somebody like Green River Killer would have been busy doing that stuff all the time, and nobody would have been able to really do anything about it. In the people who would have known, a lot of times aren't able to do anything about it because they have their own extortion. There's a whole rule set that everybody has to follow. Their own extortion would get exposed. They're not going to expose their extortion based on somebody like this. Then that's what fuels it continually and continually, and eventually these people, they, well, if they're cops, eventually they're supposed to get like noticed, and then they're supposed to be like shoved out of the police force, and then they're supposed to be shoved in a psych unit if they can't get the evidence out. See, these people are somewhat of a danger to themselves and to others. See, they're prone to wanting to kill people. They're prone to wanting to rape people. Like, if the right woman says no at them or something, then they would they'll start raping them and shit. See, they're a danger to themselves and others. If they're around little kids and shit, they'll start switching psychologically and they'll start molesting and all gross and shit. They will. That's the kind of shit. This is what happens when the cops have their blue coat of silence shit. This is what happens when they have cops that have to do this stuff. See, those cops, that's bad. That's a bad situation. It builds the super psychos because they're inoculated. Everybody else usually, if they get to this point, unless they're specific people, would basically, the cops, sleazy cop gang would bust them for some crime to get them into a jail, basically. But when it's cops that are doing it, in cop gang, then essentially everybody doesn't want to expose essentially a blackmail to be getting rid of these people. They have like a blue coat of silence about this stuff. And that this is what fuels and makes these people worse. See, the longer this shit goes on, this is why I say they get a choice. Basically, they get a choice. Either expose your stuff and turn yourself in or something and avoid this and go to prison. You see, it's a really hard choice for those people. And that's how you'll know that it's real Satanism, right? That is where this will only lead to just doing and being really horrible. And that at some point, the government is going to have to think about what black bag paddy wagoning is, all right? They need to get some of those people from the Pentagon, and they need to just be black bag paddy wagon these people, and then their anger will be so much that any psychiatrist will be able to deem them unfit or whatever, or danger to themselves and others. They'll be able to lock them in a padded room just by the anger of getting black bagged. Okay? And shoved in there. They'll be pissed. Oh yeah, because they'll be cops and shit. They'll be so fucking pissed that they'll be snapping psychologically like this and shit right in front of those people, okay? And that will be all that will ever be needed to be like justifying what they do, and that, then in the end, the Pentagon could probably get away with the initial part of that. And so then that's the whole idea, is that, this is where normally the military world would shoot them, all right? And so that's where, they can potentially justify just rounding them up and shoving them in one. And then if they act normal, And then if they address their fucking issues of psycho problem. See, the whole idea is that once somebody gets inside of a psych unit, you probably shouldn't be optimizing psychoness. You probably shouldn't say that you want to fuck Jesus. That's an important one too, especially around here. Because the Lord's is a Catholic hospital, and if you start saying that you want to fuck Jesus and shit, you probably won't get let out until you make some serious steps forward. Let's see. The whole idea is that these people, essentially, once they stop, the whole idea is that these people, the ones I'm talking about, just merely being in there is going to have them switching around psychologically. It'll be difficult for any one of those type of people to actually be leaving one, okay? But this is an important aspect. It is achievable. You people need some Thorazine. Something to smooth off the rough edges. You people just need a rest. You need to probably should avoid like reading the codes behind the codes books and stuff like that. You should probably just sit there and watch some TV. Eat the pork. Basically. Eat the pork and fill yourself up and nourish yourself back up. And, the things that they did that turned them into this, they probably won't say. But attempt to isolate any problems that might be able to come out of your mouth, because in the end, these people that are like this, they're going to need therapy in very extensive, probably there's not really much, not much in the DSM. The whole idea is that I'm watching this girl with the dragon tattoo shit. See, they put the armbands on you and shit, and that is like where there's a new emerging theoretic about that stuff. But see, if you people can't keep yourselves from being a danger to others, and if you can't keep yourself from, well, they won't kill themselves. They would have by now. Right? So, essentially it just becomes that they're a danger to others. So that requires an isolation until they can show some sort of ability to not be a danger to others. And so that's where, it's like Bruce Willis and Brad Pitt and the 12 Monkeys. See, you won't get to walk around with the tour with Brad Pitt, okay? You won't. They'll have you. It'll kind of be like, the PC, where they get out for an hour with nobody else around in the common area. It'll be like that. That's what this stuff is. So just remember that I know that at some point a solution has to be made for this problem, because, see, there's like 10 years of dumb not killing those people. See, when the Silk Road got busted, the government said no to the Pentagon about this stuff. They did. And so then those people have just been sitting around without dumb cleaning up this problem all the time. And so, the whole idea is that when adult supervision finds naughty little Pentagon being bad,